There are mornings a man walks into a room already knowing he is going to lose.
He wasn't asking for much. Just 2 weeks.
8 people heard it. 8 people looked away.
Except one. She reached into her purse. And everything changed.
The morning Everett Hart walked into Fenn's general store, he had exactly 4 cents in his left coat pocket and a prayer he no longer believed in somewhere behind his ribs. It was the kind of October morning that Colorado did not ease you into. The cold came overnight without apology, settled into the mud streets and the wooden storefronts and the gaps beneath every door in Durango, and it announced itself the way a creditor does, without warmth, without patience, without any interest in your circumstances. Everett had woken before dawn with Noah screaming in the crib beside him, the baby's face red and furious, tiny fists clenched at the air, the blanket damp from where Everett had packed it with his own spare shirt in the night trying to hold the heat in. He had run out of milk 2 days ago. He had run out of coal 4 days before that. What he had left was a dented tin of formula he had bought on credit 3 weeks ago and still had not fully paid for. Half a cord of unsplit firewood promised in exchange for 2 days of fence labor he had not yet received. And a baby boy who was 7 months old and had never once in his short life done a single thing to deserve any of this. Everett pulled Noah tighter against his chest as he pushed open the door to Fenn's. The bell above the frame gave a cheerful little ring that felt almost insulting. He nodded at the 2 men nearest the door, railroad workers, judging by their boots and their silence, and made his way toward the back counter, where Aldous Fenn stood behind a wall of shelved goods, making notes in a leather-bound ledger with the focused expression of a man who took money very personally. "Mr. Fenn," Everett said. Fenn did not look up. "I need to talk to you about my account. I know what you need to talk about." Fenn made another note, slow and deliberate, the way men do when they want you to understand that your time is less than their ink. "You're behind. I know I'm behind. I've been looking for work since the Dalton mine closed. I've had 3 interviews this week. 2 of them said they might have something by month's end." Fenn set down his pen and looked at Everett with the particular flat expression of a man who had stopped seeing the person in front of him a long time ago. "Might doesn't pay your tab, son." Everett shifted Noah to his other arm. The baby had quieted some, his head resting heavy against Everett's shoulder, the small warm weight of him the only good thing in the room. "I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm asking you for 2 more weeks. That's all. 2 weeks and 2 weeks. Fenn set it back like a punchline. He stepped around the counter, and for a moment Everett thought maybe he was coming to meet him halfway, man to man, some gesture of basic human consideration. Instead, Fenn walked straight to the shelf where Everett had originally pulled the milk tin 3 weeks ago, examined a row of identical cans with an air of professional disdain, and turned back around with his arms crossed. "You still got the tin I sold you?" "Yes, sir. Bring it." Everett hesitated. "It's half empty." "Noah's Ben, I don't care if it's all empty. Bring me what's left and we'll settle the difference." Fenn uncrossed his arms and held out one flat hand, palm up like a schoolteacher waiting on a homework assignment. "Or don't. But if you don't, I'm adding your whole balance to the sheriff's collection list by end of week. Your choice." Everett looked at that hand. He looked at it for a long moment. And then, because he did not have a better option, and because he had promised himself a year ago, the night his wife Clara died in that hospital bed with the one good candle burning down to nothing, that he would never let his son see him beg, he reached into his coat and pulled out the dented tin and set it in Aldous Fenn's outstretched hand. That was when Fenn grabbed it, not took it, grabbed it, yanked it from Everett's grip the way you snatch something back from someone who was never supposed to have it, and slammed it on the counter hard enough that Noah startled awake and let out a sharp cry. The 2 railroad men by the door both flinched at the sound. "You think credit grows on trees, boy?" Fenn leaned across the counter until his face was close enough that Everett could smell pipe tobacco and yesterday's whiskey on his breath. "Return it, every penny, or I'll have the sheriff pull that baby right out of your worthless arms and hand him to someone who can actually feed him." The silence after that sentence was the worst kind, not the silence of shock. The silence of people who had decided this was not their problem. The 2 women near the dry goods turned back to their shopping. The young clerk restocking a shelf found something very important to arrange on a lower level. The older man by the window turned a page of his newspaper. And the woman Everett had noticed when he came in, standing very still near the back wall, dressed in dark clothing, watching without expression, did not move at all. Everett felt his face go hot, which surprised him because he had thought he was past the stage of shame. He had spent 11 months since Clara's death being humiliated by circumstances he had not chosen. He had believed somewhere along the way that he had built some kind of scar tissue over the part of him that could still be wounded in public. Apparently not. "I'm not asking for charity," he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended, which somehow made it worse. "I'm asking for time. Time is money, and you don't got either one." His name is Noah. Everett said it before he could stop himself. He did not know exactly why. Maybe because Fenn had been talking about his son for the last 2 minutes as though the baby were a line item on a ledger and not a human being with a name and a birthday. A boy who laughed, actually laughed, a genuine squeal of delight whenever Everett held him up near the window to watch the horses go by. His name is Noah. He's 7 months old. His mother is dead. And I am not asking you to carry me forever. I am asking you for 2 weeks. Fenn stared at him. Then he reached under the register and produced a small piece of paper which he slid across the wood toward Everett. That's what you owe. Total. With the milk. With what you picked up in September. I've written it all out nice and clear. Everett looked at the paper. It was more than he had thought. Not by much, but by enough. End of week. Fenn was already walking back to his ledger. Good morning. Everett stood at that counter for another few seconds. Not because he had anything else to say. He was just having a small private argument with himself about whether his legs were going to cooperate, because there was something about being dismissed in front of strangers that made the muscles in a man's body uncertain about basic functions. Noah made a small sound against his shoulder. Hungry, cold, patient in the way that infants are patient, which is to say not patient at all, just not yet old enough to understand that waiting is optional. Everett turned around. He made it 3 steps toward the door before the voice came from behind him. Not from Fenn, not from any of the people who had been watching. From the woman in the dark coat near the back wall, who had not moved once since he had come in. Mr. Fenn. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It had a quality to it that Everett would struggle to describe later, not commanding exactly, not the kind of loud authority that rattles windows, but rather the quiet of someone who had never in their life needed to raise their voice to be heard, because the world had always gone quiet when she spoke. Fenn turned from his ledger with mild irritation. Mrs. Caldwell. She walked to the counter. She moved without hurry, which itself felt like a statement. She set her small leather purse on the wood, opened it, and withdrew a folded bill that she placed on the counter with one finger, pressing it flat. This gentleman's account, she said, settled in full. The store went silent again, but a different kind of silent this time. Fenn looked at the bill. He looked at Harriet Caldwell. He was running a rapid calculation behind his eyes that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with how much he could afford to argue with a woman whose cattle operation paid for roughly a quarter of his store's annual revenue. Mrs. Caldwell, that's very. And I'll take 2 tins of that formula, she said, gesturing toward the shelf. Have them wrapped, please. She turned and looked directly at Everett for the first time. Not at Noah. At Everett. Is 2 sufficient for now, or would you prefer 3? Everett opened his mouth. He closed it again. In 34 years, he had received compliments, received criticism, received the particular crushing sympathy of people at his wife's funeral who meant well and said all the wrong things. But he had never once been asked by a stranger whether 2 or 3 was sufficient, in a tone that suggested the answer genuinely mattered. 2, he said. Ma'am, 2 is. That's more than enough. But I don't. He stopped. Tried again. I don't accept charity. I'm not offering it. She turned back to Fenn with the calm efficiency of someone processing an ordinary transaction. I'm offering employment, if that's agreeable to him. A brief pause. Assuming Mr. Fenn will finish wrapping those tins sometime today. Fenn started wrapping. The women in their good wool coats were staring openly now. The man with the newspaper had put it down. The clerk on the lower shelf had abandoned all pretense of productivity and was simply standing and watching. Harriet Caldwell paid no visible attention to any of them. What kind of employment? Everett asked. The kind that involves honest work and honest pay. She accepted the paper-wrapped package from Fenn, turned, and offered it to Everett with both hands. I have a property on the north side of the ridge that has been sitting empty for 3 years. The main cottage needs rebuilding. The fencing on the lower pasture is collapsed in 4 places. The orchard has not been tended in longer than that. She paused. There is also a smaller structure attached to the cottage that could be made habitable quickly. Heatable, functional, private, which I imagine matters to you right now more than the salary. She was not wrong. Who would be watching him? Everett asked. He looked down at Noah. While I'm working, there is a woman on the property, Vera Marsh. She has been the groundskeeper's wife since before the property was mine. She has raised 4 children of her own and will take better care of your son than any nursery in this city. Harriet paused, which I am also prepared to verify in writing, if that is something you need. Everett studied her face. He was trying to find the angle. Every offer in his experience had an angle. The mine foreman who had offered housing in the company row had charged twice fair rent and taken it from wages. The church that had offered a meal after Clara's funeral had followed it with a request for tithing commitments. There was always a cost disguised as a kindness, and he had learned that lesson the way men learn expensive lessons, by paying for it. Harriet Caldwell looked back at him without blinking. There was something in her expression that was difficult to read. Not warmth exactly, not coldness either. Something more like assessment, like she was watching to see what he was made of and was genuinely uncertain which direction the answer would go. Why? He asked. It came out more directly than he intended, but she did not flinch. Because I need the work done, she said. And you need work to do. Those 2 facts do not require a more complicated explanation than that. That's not an answer. Something shifted in her face very slightly, not quite a smile. The line of her mouth did not change, but something behind her eyes that might have been, in different light, the first fraction of respect. "No," she said, "it isn't." She picked up her purse. "I will be at the North Ridge property at 8 tomorrow morning. If you come, bring the boy and we will introduce him to Vera. If you don't come," she glanced once at Fenn, then back at Everett, "then I suppose Mr. Fenn's generosity will have to suffice." She walked out. The bell above the door rang again, cheerful and indifferent, the same sound it made when anybody left. Everett stood in the middle of Fenn's general store with 2 tins of formula, wrapped in brown paper in his arms and a baby on his shoulder, and 8 different strangers pretending they had not just witnessed every second of what happened. "That's Harriet Caldwell," the older man with the newspaper said. He had apparently decided that commentary was now appropriate. "Richest widow in the territory." "I know who she is," Everett said. He didn't, actually. He had heard the name. Everybody in Durango had heard the name. But hearing a name and knowing who it belonged to were different things, and right now what he knew was this. His son was hungry, his coat had a hole in the left elbow, and a woman he had never spoken to before today had just settled his debts and offered him a cottage and asked him nothing in return except whether 2 tins or 3 was sufficient. He walked out into the cold Colorado morning. The sky above the street was the particular gray of a day that has not decided yet whether to snow. Noah made a sound just his next, not crying, just present, just there. "I know," Everett said quietly. "I know." He stood on the wooden boardwalk for a long moment, holding his son, watching the horses and the wagon traffic move up the frozen street, thinking about 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, and a woman who had walked out of a store without looking back like she already knew he would show up. The problem, the real problem, not the one involving coal or money or collapsed fencing, was that she was probably right. He would show up. He did not know why. He did not trust it. He did not trust her or himself or the strange flat-footed feeling in his chest that he had mistaken briefly for something other than desperation. But Noah needed somewhere warm, and Everett Hart, for all his pride and all his caution and all the hard lessons that 11 months of widowhood and poverty had hammered into him, was still underneath everything, a man who showed up. He pulled his coat tighter around his son and started walking. Behind him, through the glass window of Fenn's general store, 8 pairs of eyes followed him down the street. None of them said a word, but one of them, the older man, the one with the newspaper, set it down on the counter when Everett was finally out of sight, took a long breath, and said to no one in particular, "Well, I'll be." And Aldous Fenn, tallying numbers in his ledger, said nothing at all because the numbers all added up fine now. And that was in the end what mattered to Aldous Fenn. The rest of it, the man with the hungry baby, the widow who paid without being asked, the strange sharp silence that had fallen over his store like something memorable trying to happen. That was somebody else's business entirely. He turned a page in his ledger. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall. He showed up at 8 o'clock. He told himself the night before that he was only going to look, that he would ride out to the North Ridge, get a clear sense of the property, ask a few direct questions, and make a rational decision based on what he found. He told himself this the way a man tells himself things he does not entirely believe, while he was bundling a 7-month-old into every clean layer of clothing available and heating the last of the formula over a coal burner running on its final quarter-pound of fuel. The road to the North Ridge took 40 minutes on foot. Everett did not have a horse. He carried Noah in the sling Clara had sewn from canvas and old curtain fabric, a contraption that looked improvised because it was, but held the baby snug and warm against his chest. He walked through 6 inches of overnight snow with his boots wrapped in an extra layer of burlap tied off at the ankle, because the left sole had been separating since September, and cold water coming in through a boot was the kind of problem that became a serious problem fast. He found the property without much difficulty. It sat at the end of a long dirt track lined with old cottonwood trees stripped bare by October, and the cottage was, well, it was exactly what Harriet Caldwell had described, and not a syllable more flattering than that. The main structure was standing, which he supposed was the most optimistic thing you could say about it. The roof had a visible sag on the eastern side. 2 of the front windows were boarded from the outside. The porch railing had given up at some point and lay in pieces along the front foundation, half buried in snow. Beyond the cottage, maybe 30 yards uphill, a larger and considerably better maintained house sat behind an iron fence, 2 stories solid, a chimney already producing a thin thread of smoke into the gray morning sky. He was still working out the math of how bad the cottage actually was when the door to the larger house opened and Harriet Caldwell came down the path. She was dressed for working weather. That was the first thing he noticed. Not because he had expected otherwise exactly, but because the image of her in Fenn's store, composed, deliberate, the kind of woman whose presence reorganized a room, had given him a picture of her world that did not include practical boots and a coat with actual wear on the elbows. She carried a folder of papers under one arm and moved through the snow with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had been navigating difficult terrain her entire life and had stopped finding it inconvenient. "You came," she said, not triumphant, just noting the fact. "I said I would think about it. You didn't say anything." She stopped a few feet away and looked at Noah, bundled in the sling, watching her with the wide-eyed gravity that babies apply to unfamiliar faces. "How old?" 7 months last week. She nodded once, looking at the baby the way you look at something fragile that is pretending it isn't. Then she shifted her attention to the cottage. It's worse than it looks from the road, I figured. The foundation is sound. I had a man look at it in the spring. The roof needs replacing on the east side, but the bones are good timber and they're not rotted through. She opened the folder and held out a hand-drawn diagram, which Everett took. The small structure on the back, what used to be the laundry room, that's the piece that can be made livable fastest. New wood stove, patched walls, the window on the north side needs reglazing. Vera thinks 2 weeks, maybe 10 days if the weather holds. Everett looked at the diagram. It was detailed. Someone had taken considerable time on it. You drew this yourself? I draw everything myself. There was no pride in it. Just fact. Nobody else was going to. He handed it back. What are the conditions of the arrangement? She looked at him steadily. The work comes first. You rebuild the cottage. I cover materials. You provide the labor. I'll pay you a weekly wage while you're working. Fair market rate for a skilled laborer, which I've checked, and it's more than Dalton was paying, before you ask. She paused. When the main cottage is habitable, it's yours to live in. No rent while you're actively working the property. And if I stop working, then we renegotiate. She said it simply, without threat. I am not interested in trapping you here, Mr. Hart. I need the work done. You need the work. If either of those things changes, we talk about it. Everett was quiet for a moment. He looked at the cottage. He looked at his son's face, that small, serious face studying Harriet Caldwell with focused infant intensity. You mentioned something yesterday in the store. About the right to purchase. A brief silence. I did, she said. I want to understand that part. She closed the folder. When she spoke again, her voice was measured in a way that suggested she had thought carefully about how to say this. If you stay on this property and fulfill the terms of work for 3 years, completing the cottage, maintaining the land, the orchard, the fencing, I will sell you this property for $1. Legal deed, your name on it, no conditions after that. Everett stared at her. $1? $1. Why? She looked out at the cottonwood trees. The smoke from her chimney drifted east. When she answered, she did not look at him. Because I have more land than I can use and more money than I need. And I have spent enough years watching both of those things do absolutely nothing for anyone. She turned back, including me. He wanted to press it. Something in him, the part that had learned not to take things at face value. The part that Clara had sometimes called his suspicious nature, and he had preferred to call his reasonable caution, wanted to pull at the edges of that answer and see what was underneath it. But Noah chose that moment to make a decisive sound against his chest, the unmistakable pre-cry escalation that meant the discussion window was closing, and Everett reached into his coat pocket for the formula tin. Vera, Harriet said quietly. A woman appeared in the doorway of the larger house almost immediately, as if she had been waiting just inside, which Everett would later discover she almost always was. Vera Marsh was somewhere in her mid-50s, broad-shouldered, with silver hair pinned back practically and the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of outdoor work into something that looked less like age and more like bedrock. She came down the path with a directness that matched Harriet's, reached Everett without introducing herself first, looked at Noah with the assessing eye of a woman who had pulled 4 children through infancy, and said, "He's hungry." "Yes, ma'am. Give me that tin. I've got it warmed already." She held out both hands with the plain authority of someone stating a plan, not making a request. Everett hesitated for only a second, just long enough to make it clear that the hesitation was intentional, that he was not a man who handed his son to strangers without a beat of deliberation. Then he unslung Noah and placed him in Vera Marsh's arms. Vera held the baby with the automatic competence of long practice. Noah looked up at her face. She looked back at him. Some private negotiation occurred between them that took about 4 seconds. Then Noah grabbed the front of her coat with one fist and apparently decided she was acceptable. "Bottles are inside," Vera said, already walking back toward the house. "Come in when you're ready. There's coffee." She was gone. Everett watched the door close behind her, then turned to find Harriet watching him with an expression that was very nearly amusement. "She's always like that," Harriet said. "Is she good with him?" "She's good with everyone. It's slightly annoying." He almost smiled. He caught himself. They walked the property together for the next hour, the collapsed fencing along the lower pasture, the orchard with its unpruned trees standing in tangled rows, the root cellar behind the cottage with its good solid door. Harriet knew every corner of it. She pointed out drainage problems and structural advantages, and the spot near the eastern fence where underground water ran close to the surface, which she said made that section particularly useful in dry summers. She knew the soil composition. She knew which orchard trees were still viable and which ones were past saving. She had clearly spent time here, not just as an owner touring her holdings, but as someone who had looked closely at the land and thought seriously about what it could become. "You have been planning this for a while," Everett said. She did not answer immediately. They were standing at the edge of the orchard, looking up at the bare branches against a pale sky. "I have been thinking about it," she said finally. "Thinking and planning are not the same thing. What changed?" She glanced at him sideways, just briefly, a look he could not read, gone as fast as it appeared. I'm not sure yet. They turned back toward the house. As they passed the side entrance, Everett glanced through a doorway off the main hall. A small room, its window letting in the gray October light. Inside, beside a cold fireplace, sat a child's wooden chair and a painted rocking horse on the mantel. The room had not been lived in for a long time, but nothing in it had been moved. The chair was positioned as though someone had only just stood up from it. The horse faced the window as though watching for something. He did not ask about it. He followed Harriet into the kitchen and accepted the coffee Vera handed him, and he sat down when Vera told him to sit, and he let the detail of that room settle into a part of his mind where things are stored without being examined. He would understand it later. He understood enough of it already. Noah was in a low wooden chair padded with a folded blanket, Vera's improvisation, efficient and immediate, working on the formula bottle with serious concentration. He looked up once when Everett sat, seemed satisfied by what he found, and went back to the bottle. Everett started work the following Monday. The first 2 weeks were the hardest kind of hard, the kind that does not announce itself as exceptional, just grinds on, daily and cold. He started before dawn and stopped when the light failed, which in late October meant working in darkness at both ends. The laundry room structure came together first. New wood stove hauled up from a supplier in town in pieces and assembled on site. Walls re-chinked where the wind was getting in. The north window reglazed with a sheet of glass that took 3 attempts to cut correctly, and 1 attempt that produced a crack he had to explain to nobody except himself. By the end of the second week, the space was heatable and windproof. Everett moved himself and Noah out of the one-room boarding house in Durango and into the small structure behind the cottage. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was theirs. Vera came down each morning and took Noah for the day while Everett worked, and came back each evening and stayed until he had finished and cleaned up and eaten something, because she had apparently made a private decision in those first few days that feeding Everett Hart was part of her responsibilities. A decision nobody had discussed with him, but which he stopped arguing against by the end of the first week, because the food was good and the arguing was exhausting, and he was too tired in the evenings to maintain principled positions about charity versus practical arrangements. He saw Harriet most mornings. She came down to check on the work, ask questions, occasionally point out something he had not noticed. She did not hover, she did not interfere. What she did was pay attention, and the quality of her attention was different from what he was accustomed to. Not supervisory, not suspicious, just present. She looked at the work, and she looked at him, and sometimes she asked a question that revealed she had been thinking about whatever he was doing more carefully than he might have expected. One morning in mid-November, 3 weeks after he had started, she came down earlier than usual and stood at the edge of the foundation where Everett was repowering a cracked section, and watched him work for a while before she said anything. "You did not sleep last night." He did not look up from the pour. "I slept fine. The light in your window was on past 2. He did look up then. She was watching him with that level, unreadable expression, hands in her coat pockets. "Noah had a rough night," he said. "Teething coming in. Vera said she would take overnight shifts if you needed them. I don't need them." A pause. "Why not?" He set down the tool he was using and straightened up, which took a moment longer than it should have, because his back had been giving him trouble for a week, and he was too stubborn to mention it. "Because he's my son. Rough nights are part of having a son." Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are very determined to do everything the hard way. I'm determined to do it the right way. Those are not the same thing." She considered that. The wind came down off the upper pasture, cold and even. Something shifted in the air between them. Not dramatic, not the kind of shift you could point to. Just a small recalibration, like 2 compasses settling toward the same north. Harriet looked away first, toward the upper pasture. "The fencing supplier in town is overcharging on post iron," she said. "I found a man in Silverton who does better quality at 2/3 the price. I will make the introduction if you want. I would appreciate that." She nodded once and walked back toward the house. Everett watched her go. He went back to his work, but something had changed, and he knew it. He spent the rest of that morning refusing to think too carefully about what it was. The way a man refuses to look directly at something he is not ready to name yet, not because he cannot see it, but because naming it makes it real, and real things can be lost in ways that unnamed things cannot. Noah was asleep in the small structure when Everett came in that evening, bundled in the good wool blanket Vera had brought down from the main house, his face peaceful and round, entirely unconcerned with the complications of the world above him. Everett sat on the edge of his cot and looked at his son for a long time. He thought about the store, about Fenn's hand outstretched, flat and contemptuous, about the sound the tin had made when it hit the counter. He thought about 11 months of mornings waking up beside Clara's empty side of the bed and telling himself it was going to get better, because you had to tell yourself something. He thought about the moment on the wooden boardwalk outside Fenn's store when he had stood in the cold with 2 wrapped tins in his arms and felt, for just one unguarded second, like something in the world had shifted. He had spent 3 weeks since then trying to figure out if that feeling was something he could trust. He was still trying. He pulled off his boots and laid down on the cot with his coat over him because the fire was burning low and he was too tired to stoke it properly. He listened to his son breathe in the dark. Outside, the wind moved through the bare cottonwood trees along the drive with a sound like something being slowly let go. He was asleep before he finished the thought. In the larger house on the hill, a light stayed on in the second-floor window for another 2 hours. The woman behind it sat at her desk with the hand-drawn diagrams of the North Ridge spread before her, the cottage, the orchard, the fencing lines she had mapped alone over 3 years of thinking without acting. She did not look at them. She was thinking about a man who said rough nights are part of having a son, as though the statement required no further defense, as though it were simply a fact like weather. She had spent a considerable portion of her adult life in the company of men who explained themselves at length, men who justified and qualified and anticipated objection. The absence of all of that in Everett Hart was something she had not expected and did not entirely know what to do with. She turned the lamp down at last. Outside, the first snow of that season had stopped falling, and the North Ridge lay white and very still, and the small structure behind the cottage showed one window dark. The talk started in December. Everett had known it was coming. He would have been naive not to. Durango in 1888 was a city growing fast and had not yet developed the social sophistication to mind its own business with any consistency. And the image of Harriet Caldwell, the Caldwell widow as people called her, the woman whose late husband's cattle empire formed the foundation of a significant portion of the territory's economy, spending time on a remote property with a penniless widower, was not an image that the town's social architecture was built to ignore. The first thing he heard came from the lumber supplier he had gone to pick up materials from on a Tuesday morning. The man made a comment, oblique, delivered with a smirk he did not bother to hide entirely, about Everett's arrangement on the ridge and whether the work involved was entirely of the structural variety. Everett loaded his lumber without responding. He drove the wagon back to the property and unloaded it, and spent about 20 minutes after dinner sitting in the chair beside Noah's crib, working through the particular controlled anger of a man who knows the correct response is silence, but finds silence very expensive. He told Harriet the following morning. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who was it? Doesn't matter." "It doesn't," she agreed. "But I'm curious. Hollis, the lumberman. I've bought materials from Hollis for 11 years. She said it without particular emotion. "He'll think twice. Mrs. Caldwell, I'm not going to have a confrontation with him. I'm simply going to take my business to Patterson's yard on the north end. Hollis will notice the absence. Men like that always do." She met his eyes, which is a distinction that matters to me, even if it doesn't matter to anyone else. It was that sentence, not the action, but the explanation, that stayed with him. He was still thinking about it 3 days later when a carriage he did not recognize appeared on the road to the North Ridge. He had seen Silus Drummond twice before, both times at a distance. Once on the main street in Durango, once at the edge of a public land auction Everett had attended 6 months before the mine closed, when he had still been trying to think about the future in practical terms. Drummond was somewhere in his late 40s, broad in the shoulder, with the look of a man who had never once in his life been physically uncomfortable without doing something immediately to correct the situation. He ran land operations that stretched across 3 counties, owned 2 banks he did not officially own, and carried about him the particular social ease of men who had always moved in circles where being liked and being feared were not mutually exclusive. He did not get out of the carriage. He stopped it on the road beside the property line and called out to Everett, who was working on the fence posts along the lower pasture. "Hart." Everett kept working. He finished driving the post he was on, then straightened up and turned around. But he did not walk toward the carriage. "Mr. Drummond," he said. Drummond leaned out the window. He was smiling the way powerful men smile at people they're about to be reasonable with. "I wanted to introduce myself properly. I've been meaning to come up for a few weeks, but the season kept me busy. I know who you are. Good. Saves time." Drummond looked around the property with an expression of mild assessment. "You've done some work up here, some? Mrs. Caldwell keeping you busy?" The question had a texture to it that was not accidental. Everett looked at him steadily and did not answer. Drummond adjusted his expression, the smile recalibrating into something more direct. "I'll be plain with you, Hart. I respect your time. I've had an interest in this parcel for going on 4 years. Mrs. Caldwell has declined to discuss it, which is her right, but the situation has become somewhat more complicated now that there are personal elements involved that may be clouding the picture." "What situation?" "The situation where you are living on her property under an arrangement that no one in this county fully understands and half the town is talking about." The smile was gone now. "I'm not trying to cause trouble for you. I'm trying to explain that you've put yourself in a position that is going to be very difficult to hold. There are people in this territory, men with legal resources, men of influence, who take an interest in how widows manage their estates, particularly when outside parties appear and arrangements are made that might not withstand scrutiny." Everett looked at him for a long moment. "Are you threatening her?" "I'm informing you," Drummond said, "as a courtesy." "A courtesy." Everett walked 3 steps toward the carriage, close enough that Drummond's driver shifted slightly in his seat. He kept his voice level. "Then let me extend one back. Mrs. Caldwell makes her own decisions. I work for her. That's the whole of the arrangement. Whatever interest you have in this land is a matter between you and her, not you and me. Drummond studied him. Something moved behind the man's eyes, something older and less civilized than the smile or the reasonable delivery. Something that had been there all along and had simply stopped bothering to stay hidden. "You seem like a reasonable man," Drummond said. "I'm a working man," Everett said, "which right now means I need to get back to my fence posts." He turned around and went back to work. The carriage stayed on the road for another full minute. He did not turn to watch it leave. He just kept driving posts, steady and even one after another, until he heard the wheels finally begin to move away down the frozen track. That evening, Harriet came down to the cottage after supper, not at the regular morning hour. After supper, which was unusual, she knocked at the door of the small structure, and when Everett opened it, she was holding 2 cups of coffee, and she said, "Drummond came to the house this afternoon. He came here first," Everett said. She handed him one of the cups. "Come outside. I'd rather not have this conversation where the walls are thin." They sat on the front step of the cottage, still more construction site than entrance. The porch reconstruction barely started, in the cold dark with their coffee. And Harriet told him what Drummond had said to her, which was considerably more than what he had said to Everett. There were legal insinuations about the terms of her late husband's estate. There was language about the responsibilities of trustworthy stewardship of Caldwell Holdings. There was, carefully wrapped in procedural concern, a suggestion that the arrangement with Everett represented a vulnerability in how she managed the estate. A vulnerability that certain parties might feel obligated to raise with the territory's court. "He can't actually do anything," Harriet said. "The estate is fully mine, has been for 7 years. The legal standing is not in question." She paused. "But he can make the process of doing anything expensive. Time, lawyers, public attention." She looked out at the dark field. "He has done it before, to other people. To get land. Always to get land." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "He has wanted this parcel since Robert died. It sits between 2 of his operations, and it would allow him to close a gap that currently costs him considerably in logistics." Everett thought about this. "What do you want to do?" She turned to look at him. In the dark, her expression was harder to read than usual. "I want to continue exactly as planned," she said, "even if he follows through on the legal pressure, especially then." Something in her voice had hardened, but not in the brittle way, in the way that stone is hard that has been under pressure long enough to become something that does not break. "I have spent 20 years in this territory doing what was expected of me, and managing my holdings the way people expected a woman in my position to manage them." She paused. "I have never once made a decision I was proud of specifically because someone else told me I had to." She looked at him directly. "I am not starting now because Silus Drummond wants my fence line." Everett looked at her. The coffee had gone mostly cold in his cup. "All right," he said. "All right," she repeated. A ghost of something, not a smile but the shape of one, crossed her face. "Get some sleep, Mr. Hart. You have the south fence section tomorrow." "I know." She stood up, took her cup, and walked back toward the house. He sat there for a while after she left. The night was very clear and very cold, the kind of cold that had weight to it. And above the ridge, the stars were doing what they always did. Indifferent and brilliant, the same stars that had been there every other night of his life, looking no different for everything that had changed beneath them. He finished the cold coffee. He went inside. Noah was asleep in his crib, bundled in the good blanket Vera had brought down, his face peaceful and round and entirely unconcerned with Silus Drummond or property lines or the things people said in town. Everett sat on the edge of his cot and looked at his son for a long time. Then he lay down and listened to the wind move through the cottonwood trees and was asleep before he finished the thought he had started. In the larger house on the hill, a light stayed on in the second-floor study window past midnight. Harriet sat at her desk with the land survey maps open before her and her pen in her hand and did not write a single word. She was thinking about a conversation on a cold porch step and a man who had said all right with the simplicity of someone who had made a decision before you finished asking the question. She had known men who deliberated, men who weighed and measured and consulted. Robert had been such a man, and she had valued it. She understood now that there were different kinds of certainty. She set down the pen. Outside, the cottonwood trees moved in the wind, their bare branches making the sound of something being worked out in a language she almost knew. The announcement happened on a Tuesday. Everett did not know it was coming. That was the part he kept returning to afterward. Not what Harriet said, not the crowd's reaction, not even Drummond's response when he eventually heard about it, but the simple fact that she had not told him, that she had made a decision of that magnitude, a decision that would reorder both of their lives and every relationship she had spent decades building in this territory, and she had not mentioned it to him the night before, or the morning of, or at any point in the preceding week when he had been right there. 20 yards from her front door, working in the cold. He found out the same way everybody else did. The occasion was the Durango Merchants' Winter Assembly, held the second Tuesday of December in the main hall above the bank on Reyes Street. Harriet had attended every year for the better part of 2 decades, first beside her husband Robert, and then alone after his death, and her presence was considered one of the reliable fixtures of the event. The Caldwell name on the attendee list was the kind of social confirmation that made other people feel the gathering was legitimate. Everett had not been invited and had no reason to attend, and was at the time the assembly began on his knees in the main cottage, pulling up warped floorboards in the front room. Vera came to get him just after 7. She appeared in the cottage doorway with her coat half-buttoned and a look on her face that Everett had not seen before. Not alarmed exactly, but altered. The expression of someone who has received news that requires a different mental gear than the one they were running in. "You need to come to town," she said. He looked up from the floor. "What happened?" "Mrs. Caldwell is at the assembly hall." Vera paused, which was not something she did often. "She's made a public announcement." He waited. "About you," Vera said, "and the property, and some other things." Another pause. "You should hear it yourself." He pulled on his coat and they drove into Durango in the dark in Vera's wagon, Noah bundled between them under a wool blanket. Everett spent the 40 minutes of that drive running through what the announcement might be. He thought about the lease. He thought about Drummond. He thought about the conversation on the cottage step 2 weeks ago, when Harriet had said she intended to continue exactly as planned, and the way she had said it. Not bravely. Not with the self-conscious delivery of someone performing resolve, but with a flatness that meant the decision was already settled and the only question remaining was execution. He should have known then that execution, for Harriet Caldwell, meant something more than quietly holding her ground. The assembly hall was still full when they arrived. The formal portion of the evening was over. He could tell from the noise coming through the doors, the particular mixed register of a crowd that had moved past structured proceedings into something more ungoverned. Vera stayed outside with Noah. Everett went in alone. The room was warm and lamplit and packed with the territory's commercial class. Merchants, suppliers, 2 bank officers, the owner of the largest freighting operation west of the pass, assorted wives and associates arranged along the perimeter. There was a raised platform at the front with a lectern that now stood empty. And in the middle of the room, surrounded by a loose constellation of people in various states of reaction, stood Harriet. She was not holding court. She was not performing. She was having what appeared to be a very controlled conversation with a man Everett recognized as Bertram Hale, who ran the largest dry goods operation in 3 counties and who was currently speaking with the careful emphasis of a man trying very hard to remain civil while conveying deep personal offense. "You cannot simply make these decisions unilaterally, Harriet. The implications for how the community perceives." "I have made decisions unilaterally for 20 years, Bertram." She was looking at him with the patient steadiness of someone waiting for a sentence to finish. "You have never found it objectionable before. This is different." "How?" Hale did not answer immediately, which told Everett that the honest answer was something Hale did not want to say out loud in company. Everett scanned the room. He found what he was looking for near the far wall. 2 men he did not know personally, but recognized from Drummond's carriage visit in November. Associates of some kind, watching the room with the detached professional attention of people who were here to observe rather than participate. Drummond himself was not present, which felt deliberate. Someone near the door recognized Everett, and the whisper went through the room like water finding level. Heads turned. Harriet looked across the crowd and found him, and something in her expression shifted. Not relief, not apology. Something harder to name. Acknowledgement, maybe. The look of a person who has done a difficult thing and is now watching the person most affected by it arrive to find out what she did. He made his way through the crowd toward her. People moved aside, not hostily, but with the particular social delicacy of people who are not sure yet which way this is going and do not want to be standing in the wrong place when it resolves. "Mr. Hart." Her voice was even. "Mrs. Caldwell." He stopped in front of her. He kept his voice low. "What did you do?" She looked at him with that level gaze. "I protected the arrangement by announcing it publicly, by putting it beyond reach." She glanced briefly at Hale, then back. "Drummond filed a legal inquiry with the Territorial Administrator's office last week, challenging the terms of the estate on grounds of improper management. It is a mechanism he has used before. It takes approximately 8 months and considerable money to resolve, even when the outcome is never in question." She paused, "unless the arrangement in question is already a matter of public legal record and community knowledge, at which point the political cost of pursuing it becomes higher than the benefit." Everett looked at her. "You turned it into a public record. I filed the lease agreement with the county clerk yesterday morning. Tonight I announced the terms to the assembly." She did not blink. "The lease is protected. The purchase option is on record. There is nothing Drummond can challenge now without challenging a documented legal arrangement that has been publicly witnessed by the commercial class of this community, including 2 men who sit on the Territorial Administrator's Advisory Council." A pause. "You could have told me," he said. "I could have." She held his gaze. "I didn't want to give you the opportunity to talk me out of it." The honest directness of that landed somewhere in his chest in a way he did not have immediate access to the right response for. Hale, who had been standing at the edge of this exchange with the barely contained energy of a man with unfinished objections, chose this moment to reinsert himself. "Harriet, I'm going to say plainly what others are too polite to say. What you've done tonight, the lease, the purchase option, this, he gestured vaguely at Everett, in a way that managed to be offensive without technically involving a word, arrangement. People are going to talk. People are already talking. This affects the reputation of your house. Your husband's legacy. Robert has been dead for 7 years. Harriet said it without inflection. His legacy is not my responsibility to curate at the cost of my own decisions. She also announced a school, said a woman's voice from somewhere to the left. The crowd shifted. A woman Everett did not know, 50s, sharp-faced, expensive coat, was addressing the room rather than Harriet specifically. For the railroad workers' families. And a nursery, I heard, said someone else. The capital she's committing. It's her capital, said a third voice. Younger. From the back of the room. There was a brief silence in which that sentence reorganized the room's atmosphere very slightly. Harriet did not look at any of them. She was looking at Everett. And the expression on her face was the one he had been trying to read since the morning in October, when she had handed him that diagram and said thinking and planning are not the same thing. He was getting better at reading it. It meant she was waiting for a verdict, and she was not certain of the outcome, and she was not going to let that uncertainty show any further than what was already visible. The school, he said. There are 43 children of railroad workers in this county who have no schooling past the age of 8. The nursery means their mothers can work without leaving infants unattended. She paused. I have had the plans drawn for a year. The cottage arrangement gave me the reason to do it now rather than continuing to think about doing it. He looked at her for a long moment. You used me as cover. I used the situation as an occasion. That is different, is it? She did not elaborate. She just held his gaze and waited. He turned and looked at the room, at Hale's offended stillness, at the women in their good coats, at the 2 Drummond associates by the wall who were now having a quiet conversation with each other, at the younger voice in the back who had said it's her capital, and was now looking at his boots with the satisfaction almost who had said the right thing and was not sure yet if they would be thanked for it. All right, Everett said. All right, what? All right, it's different. He looked back at her. But you still should have told me. Something released in her face, just slightly. The set of her jaw changed by a fraction. Yes, she said. I should have, that was all. But it was the first time he had heard her concede anything, and it meant more than whatever she might have said if she had tried to explain it further. He left before Hale finished his objections. He went back outside where Vera and Noah were waiting in the cold. He stood beside the wagon for a moment, saying nothing, and Vera looked at him and said, Well, she announced everything publicly, he said. I know. I talked to someone coming out. Vera repositioned Noah in her arms. The baby was awake, looking at the lamplight from the hall windows with the absorbed attention he gave to all illuminated things. What are you going to do? Everett looked up at the sky. Clear night, more stars than the town's lamps could compete with. Keep working, he said. Vera made the sound she made when she thought someone was being deliberately obtuse, but decided not to push it. They drove back to the ridge in the cold dark. The consequences came in January. The first was the bank. The director of the Durango Territorial Savings sent a letter informing Harriet that, given recent developments and certain concerns among the institution's directors regarding estate management, he would be recommending a review of the lending arrangements currently extended to her commercial operations. The language was bureaucratic and careful and meant, when translated, that the bank was considering making her financing more expensive as a mechanism of social pressure. Harriet read the letter at the kitchen table with her coffee, then folded it and set it aside with the same expression she applied to most bad news, the look of someone filing information in the correct mental location without spending additional energy on it. Can they do it? Everett asked. He had started taking his morning coffee in the main house kitchen sometime in December. Not by design, but because Vera had started making enough for 3, and it was cold in the cottage before the stove got going, and the arrangement had simply persisted without anyone deciding it should. Technically, yes, Harriet said. Practically, it will cost them more than it costs me. 2 of my accounts alone represent. It doesn't matter. The number is large. She picked up her cup. The director is performing discomfort for the benefit of people who have asked him to perform it. He will settle, and if he doesn't, I will find a bank in Denver that is not interested in managing my personal choices alongside my deposits. Everett looked at her over his cup. You're very calm about this. I'm very tired, she said, with a frankness that surprised him. Which looks like calm from outside. She set down the cup. I have been managing other people's reactions to my decision since Robert died, and in some cases before that. I have a limited amount of energy for it, and I have learned to spend it on the decisions themselves rather than worrying about the reactions. He understood it the way you understand a thing you have lived inside without naming, not as new information, but as recognition. The year after Clara's death had taught him the same lesson in a different register. He had made peace with being someone other people had opinions about. What he was still working out was whether it bothered him that Harriet was now in that position, partly because of him. He went back to work. The cottage main structure was coming together. The new roof section was done. The framing on the east side replaced. The windows reglazed and properly fitted. What remained was interior work, slower, more detailed, requiring a different kind of attention. He was rehanging the front door one morning in late January when he heard a wagon on the road and looked up to see a vehicle he did not recognize stopping at the property line. 3 men got out. They were well dressed for field work, which meant they were not there for field work. One of them had a document case under his arm. Everett put down the door hinge he was working with and walked to the fence line. "Help you?" he said. The one with the document case introduced himself as a surveyor's assistant from the county office, accompanying 2 representatives of the Drummond Land and Cattle Company, who wished to conduct a boundary verification of the Caldwell North Ridge parcel in accordance with a request filed with the county assessor. A request filed by who? The request was filed by the Drummond Company. It's a standard procedure when there are questions about the documented boundaries. There aren't questions, Everett said. The boundaries are recorded, have been for 20 years. Nevertheless, the man said, with the apologetic blankness of someone delivering a message they did not write, the assessment has been requested and approved, and we are authorized to conduct it. Everett looked at the 2 Drummond men. They looked back at him with the professional stillness of people paid to stand somewhere and not explain themselves. "Then conduct it from the road," Everett said. "You don't have right of access to the property without Mrs. Caldwell's permission, and she hasn't given it." One of the Drummond men said, "Mr. Hart, I think you know who we represent." "Good. Then you also know she's up at the main house, and you're welcome to ask her directly." He picked up the door hinge again. "I'll be here." They conferred quietly among themselves, then drove the wagon up the track to the main house. Everett watched them go, then went back to the door. 20 minutes later, Harriet appeared at the top of the track and walked down without her coat, which meant she had come out quickly. "They've left," she said. "What did they say?" "Drummond is claiming there is a discrepancy in the northeast boundary that may affect the property's legal description in the lease." She stopped beside him. Her breath was visible in the cold air. "There is no discrepancy. The claim is fabricated to give him grounds to contest the lease filing in court." Everett set down the hinge for the second time that morning. "What do you need?" She looked at him for a moment, and he realized it was the question itself, not the practical content of it, but the shape of it. Not "what are you going to do?" Not "this is getting complicated." Just, "What do you need?" "My lawyer is in Denver," she said. "I need to send him a letter today, and I may need to go there next week." She paused. "There is something else." He waited. "Drummond is going to increase the pressure before the court process starts. That is how he works. He makes things uncomfortable enough that the legal process looks like relief by comparison. He will make approaches to suppliers. He may make things difficult for Vera's husband, who has business relationships in town." Her voice was steady but carried that quality again. Stone under sustained pressure. "I want you to know what is coming so it does not come as a surprise." "It won't," Everett said. "I knew who Drummond was when he pulled up on the road in November. And I told you then, your land, your decision. Nothing has changed." She was quiet for a moment in a way that felt different from her usual silences. More open, somehow. Less armored. "You could leave," she said. "I want to be honest with you about that. The legal arrangement protects you on paper, but Drummond could make the practical reality of staying here difficult in ways that Mrs. Caldwell." He said it quietly, but it stopped her. "I grew up in a company mining town in Nevada. My father worked for men like Drummond for 30 years, and I watched what that does. I know what men like that look like, and I know what they do." He looked at her, "And I know the 2 things they cannot tolerate." She waited. "People who don't need them," he said, "and people who aren't afraid of them." A long pause. "Which are you?" she asked. Both. He held her gaze. On a good day, something in her face moved. Not the fraction of a smile she sometimes allowed herself. Something more substantial than that. Something she did not cover quickly enough. Something that looked, if he was reading it right, and he was not certain he was, a great deal like the specific kind of relief that comes not from a problem being solved, but from a person being exactly what you had hoped they were. She recovered herself. Looked at the door he was rehanging. "Is the frame level?" He glanced at it. "Almost. There's a slight angle on the east jamb." She looked. She was right. "You have a good eye," he said. "I have a good eye for things that aren't straight." And there was the very faint shape of something wry in it, barely there, gone almost before it arrived. She picked up her coat collar against the wind. "I'll send the letter to Denver today." "Thank you, Mr. Hart." She walked back up to the house. Everett stood at the door for a long moment after she had gone, the hinge cold in his hand, the wind coming down off the ridge with the particular edge it got in January. He thought about the assembly hall and the folded bank letter and the Drummond men on the road, and he tried to build an honest accounting of the situation. The honest accounting was this. He had arrived in October with 4 cents and a baby and exactly no plan beyond not surrendering. And now it was January, and he had a roof and work and a legal right to property and a son who was learning to pull himself upright against the leg of Vera's kitchen table. And on the other side of that ledger was a powerful man with lawyers and money, and 2 banks he did not officially own, who had decided that Everett Hart and Harriet Caldwell were a problem that needed resolving. He was not going to pretend he was not afraid of what Drummond could do. He had seen men broken by smaller forces. He knew how this kind of power worked on ordinary people who did not have the resources to sustain a legal fight or the connections to absorb economic pressure. But he also knew something else. He looked at the door, found the east jamb, adjusted the hinge by a quarter inch and tested the swing. The door settled into its frame with the quiet solidity of a thing that has been put right. He drove the pin home and went back to work. That evening, a lamp came on in the study window of the main house and stayed on through the dinner hour and into the night. And Everett, eating in the cottage with Noah practicing his new standing trick against the table leg, looked up at that lit window once and thought about a woman writing to Denver with the same careful attention she brought to boundary surveys and orchard assessments, and the specific angle of a door jamb that was not quite level. Noah fell down, sat for a moment with an expression of genuine surprise, then grabbed the table leg and pulled himself up again. Everett watched him. "Yeah," he said, to his son or to the lit window or to no one in particular. "That's about the size of it." The snow came the following week. Not the blizzard that was still building itself out in the northern ranges, but a serious snow, 2 feet in 36 hours, the kind that clarified things. It closed the road to Durango for 4 days. It killed 3 of the fence posts Everett had driven along the east boundary, and he had to dig them out and reset them in frozen ground. It brought down a section of the cottage roof, not the section he had rebuilt, but the other section, the part he had assessed in November and marked as marginal, which turned out to have been a generous assessment. He was on the roof in weather a reasonable man would have called unsuitable for roof work, trying to get a tarp secured over the failed section before the interior took more water damage, when he heard someone calling from below. He looked down. Harriet was standing in the snow below the roof line, holding one end of the rope he had thrown down to stabilize the tarp. She had hold of it with both hands, her boots sunk 6 inches into the snowpack, looking up at him with the expression of someone who has assessed a situation, made a decision, and is not currently interested in discussing whether the decision was advisable. "You didn't have to," he started. "The tarp is moving," she said. "Tell me when." He worked for 20 minutes on the roof in heavy snow with Harriet holding the rope below. The arrangement was awkward and imperfect, and the tarp got secured in a way that would hold for now and need proper attention when the weather broke. When he climbed down the ladder, his hands were stiff, and his back was worse than it had been all week, and there was a split in the knee of his work pants where he had caught it on a nail. She handed him the rope end. They were standing very close in the narrow space between the ladder and the cottage wall, closer than they had ever stood before, both of them cold and wet and breathing hard from the effort. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him, snow on her coat, on her hair, her cheeks red from the cold. "The tarp needs permanent repair," she said. "When the weather breaks. I know. I have a contact in town who does roofing work. I can ask him, I'll do it. You can't do everything. I can do the roof." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was complicated. Several things at once, some of them contradicting each other, none of them easy to name. "You are," she said finally, "the most stubborn person I have met in 46 years of meeting people. I've been told." "By who?" He said it without premeditation. The way some things come out after enough time, when the distance between what you think and what you say has been worn down by cold and exhaustion and months of standing close enough to someone to notice the exact way the light changes in their expression. "My wife," he said. "She said it was both my best and worst quality, depending on the day." A silence. The snow came down between them, quiet and indifferent. "She was right," Harriet said. Her voice had changed, softer without being gentle, careful with the word. "She sounds like she was a perceptive person." She was. Everett looked at his hands. "The most perceptive person I've ever known." He paused. The snow kept falling. Until recently, he had not planned to say that either. Harriet looked at him for a long moment. He could not read her expression, and he stopped trying. He just stood there in the snow and let the sentence be what it was. Not a declaration, not a carefully constructed thing, just the truth that had finally gotten tired of waiting. She turned and walked back toward the main house without responding. He watched her go. He stood there in the falling snow for a while afterward, not moving, the rope in his hands, the cold settling into his wet coat, and tried to decide whether he had said the right thing or made a significant error. He could not tell. He went inside and changed his shirt and stopped by Noah's crib where the baby was sleeping through all of it, as babies sleep through the complicated things, soundly and without apology. Everett sat beside him in the cold cottage and listened to the snow and thought about perceptive women and the particular loneliness of being known by someone who was no longer there, and the stranger, newer loneliness of starting to be known again and not being certain yet whether it was safe. In the larger house on the hill, the light in the study window came on and stayed on past midnight. Harriet sat at her desk and did not write anything at all. She simply sat in the warmth of the lamp and held the 2 words he had said in the snow, until recently, and did not try to put them anywhere useful. She had spent 20 years being useful with difficult information. She let these 2 words simply exist in the room with her, the way you let something exist when you are finally too tired to argue with what it means. She turned the lamp down at last. Outside, the snow had stopped. The path between the cottage and the main house was no longer visible, covered over, made uniform by the fresh fall, but she knew exactly where it ran. She had watched it form, step by step, without anyone deciding it should be there. What happened in March was the thing Everett had been braced for without knowing exactly what shape it would take. Silus Drummond came to the main house on a Thursday morning without sending word ahead. That was the first indication that something had shifted, that the careful procedural distance Drummond had maintained since November, the surveyors and the legal letters and the men in carriages who delivered messages rather than having conversations, had been a strategy rather than a preference, and the strategy had been revised. Harriet told Everett about it that evening at the kitchen table, after Vera had taken Noah upstairs and the house had gone quiet around them. She described it without drama, the way she described most difficult things, precisely, and without spending more words on it than the facts required. Drummond had sat in the front parlor. He had accepted coffee. He had made, in the measured tones of a man accustomed to being reasonable, what amounted to a final offer. He had the connections, he said, to sustain the boundary challenge in territorial court for 2 years at minimum. Not because the case had merit, he did not insult her by pretending otherwise, but because he had the resources to make the process itself the punishment, and he had done exactly that to other landowners in this territory, and they both knew the outcomes. He was not an unreasonable man, he was simply a practical one. The Northridge parcel at fair market value. Both of them walked away clean. Harriet had listened to all of it. Then she had poured a second cup of tea, set the pot down with the same deliberateness she brought to everything, and said, "Silas, you have been trying to make me uncomfortable since Robert died. You have gotten considerably better at it over the years, but you have never once made me reconsider." Drummond had looked at her for a long moment, and then for the first time in any of their interactions he had left without smiling. Everett listened to all of this. He was looking at Harriet's face in the lamplight, at the careful steadiness she maintained even now, even in her own kitchen, telling the story to the one person she did not need to perform for. He thought about what it cost to hold that stillness for 20 years, the specific ongoing expenditure of it, the way some people made endurance look effortless from the outside and you never saw the accounting until you were close enough to notice what was being spent. She finished and was quiet. "What did he say when he left?" Everett asked. "Nothing," she said. "He just left." That was the part that concerned her more than anything he had actually said, the absence of the usual parting pleasantry, the dropped performance of civility. It meant he had moved past the stage where appearances mattered to him. Everett thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "He'll make another approach. Not through lawyers this time." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I think so too." He was right. The approach came 3 days later on a Saturday morning outside the hardware supplier on Calvert Street where Everett had gone to pick up roofing nails and a length of copper pipe. He came out of the store with his crate and found 3 men waiting beside his wagon. Not Drummond's formal associates, rougher than that, chosen for their size rather than their paperwork skills, standing in the cold street with the relaxed readiness of people who have been given a straightforward assignment and are not expecting complications. The largest one said his name. Everett set the crate down on the wagon bed and turned around. He stopped about 6 feet from them, which was a considered distance. "Yeah," he said. "Mr. Drummond wants you to understand something. I'm listening. The legal situation with the Caldwell estate is going to resolve itself one way or another. That's just paperwork and time." The man shifted his weight. "What Mr. Drummond would like you to understand personally is that there are things the law doesn't touch. Supply arrangements, business relationships. The kind of informal networks that make it easy or hard to operate in a territory." He paused. "Mr. Drummond has a long memory and a wide reach, and he's been very patient with this situation. He wants to know if there's a number." "A number," Everett said. "Something that would make relocating feel reasonable. Fresh start somewhere else. You've got a kid. Man in your position could use a stake. Start over in Utah, New Mexico. Mr. Drummond is prepared to be generous." Everett looked at the 3 of them. He thought about the fence post driven into frozen ground, the cottage roof in a snowstorm, the morning coffee in Harriet's kitchen, Noah pulling himself upright against the table leg, falling, getting up again. He thought about a woman standing in the snow holding a rope with both hands and not explaining why. "Tell Mr. Drummond," he said, "that there isn't a number." A pause. The largest man looked at him with something that was not quite surprise but close to it, the expression of someone who had expected negotiation and received instead a closed door. "You should think carefully about that answer." "I have." Everett picked up the crate of roofing nails. "Are we done?" They let him go, which told him something, that they were messengers rather than operators, and that Drummond had not yet decided to move past pressure into something harder. The legal strategy was still his primary instrument. The men on the street were theater. He told Harriet that evening. She listened the way she's always listened, completely without interrupting, her eyes on some middle distance that was not the room but was not nowhere either. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He offered you money to leave," she said. "Yes." "How much?" He almost smiled. He didn't get to the number. "I didn't give him room." She looked at him directly. "Why not? You could have let him name it. Heard the amount. Come back, told me. It would have been useful information." "I know." "So why?" "Because there is a version of this," he said, "where I sit here and tell you the number he named and we are both sitting here wondering whether I thought about it." He met her eyes. "I didn't want you to wonder, and I didn't want to think about it myself." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the March wind pressed against the walls of the house with the particular persistence that wind has when winter is not finished but can feel the season turning against it. Harriet looked at her hands, which were flat on the table in front of her. The posture she had when she was working something out, holding herself still while something moved underneath. A long moment passed, then another. The fire in the stove held its low, steady sound. Everett did not fill the silence. He had learned over the past 5 months that her silences were not gaps to be closed, but spaces she was using. He waited, then she said, "Everett." His name, not Mr. Hart. Just his name, the way she had begun to say it, with the ease of a word that had been used privately for a long time and had simply stopped being edited out. "I need to tell you something." He waited. "When I paid your account at Fenn's store," she said slowly, "I told myself it was a practical decision, that I needed work done and you needed work, and the transaction was simple." She paused. "I have been telling myself versions of that for 5 months. He was very still. "I am not interested in performing clarity I don't have," she said. "I am 46 years old and I have not been young enough to be reckless for a considerable amount of time. But I think I owe you honesty more than I owe you composure." She looked at her hands. "This stopped being a practical arrangement for me some time ago. I don't know what to do with that. I am not asking you to do anything with it either. She stopped, restarted. "I thought you should know." The lamp burned between them. The fire held its low note. Somewhere upstairs, Noah made a small sound in his sleep, one of those brief murmurs that meant nothing, just the sound of a child moving through a dream and finding it acceptable. Everett looked at Harriet Caldwell, at the careful set of her shoulders, at the deliberate evenness of her voice that was the way she managed the things that cost her the most, at the hands on the table that were completely still in the concentrated way of hands working hard at being still. "Harriet," he said. She looked up. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while." He held her gaze. "I didn't say anything because I didn't think I had the right to. You've given me work and shelter and legal protection, and I didn't want what I felt to become something you had to manage on top of everything else you were already managing." She looked at him for a long moment. Several things moved through her expression at once, and she was not fully controlling all of them, which was unusual enough that it changed the quality of the room. "That is a very considerate reason," she said. "I have occasional moments." Something broke loose in her face. Not tears, nothing dramatic. Just the sudden absence of the particular held tension she had been carrying since October, since before October, since longer ago than either of them could precisely locate. "I am not built for," she started. "Neither am I," he said. "Right now." A pause. "I don't think that means no," she said. "I don't think it does either." They sat with that for a while. The lamp burned low. Somewhere in the house, Vera moved through a hallway, her footsteps unhurried and tactfully distant. The March wind went on pressing at the walls, and the two of them sat at the kitchen table and let the thing they had been not quite saying for 5 months settle into the room and take up the space it had earned. The legal situation with Drummond resolved itself in April, earlier than anyone had expected, and in a manner that Everett would later describe to Vera as anticlimactic, which was the word for most things that seem inevitable once they are over. Harriet's lawyer in Denver, a man named Gideon Marsh, who communicated entirely in long and densely argued letters that Harriet translated for Everett in brief functional summaries, had spent 2 months quietly building a counterposition around Drummond's boundary survey challenge. The challenge itself was thin. Everyone who looked at it honestly said so. But Drummond had sustained thin cases before through attrition, and the plan had been to do the same here. What Drummond had not accounted for, or had accounted for incorrectly, was Harriet's willingness to spend money on the counter. Previous targets had settled not because they were wrong, but because the process was more expensive than surrender. Drummond had optimized for that calculation. Harriet was not optimizing for the same thing. She had the resources to outlast him, and she had, as Gideon Marsh put it in one of his letters in the driest possible prose, demonstrated a notable absence of motivation to settle. In the second week of April, Drummond withdrew the boundary challenge. Harriet read the notice at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning and set it beside her coffee cup without expression. "It's done?" Everett asked. "The boundary challenge is withdrawn." She picked up her cup. "He still has the option to file other challenges. Will he?" She looked at the notice for a moment. "No. The cost-benefit no longer works in his favor, and Drummond is fundamentally a practical man." She paused. "He will find another property to pursue." "How do you know he won't come back to this one?" "Because I am going to do something that makes this property considerably less attractive to contest." She set down her cup and looked at him directly. "I want to transfer a portion of the land into your name now. Not the whole parcel. The lease runs 3 years, and I believe the terms of the lease should be honored. But the cottage site and the immediate acreage around it. Your name on that portion, legal and recorded." She held his gaze. "It makes any future challenge more complicated than it is worth." Everett looked at her. "That wasn't part of the arrangement," he said. "The arrangement was to protect your situation. This protects it better. Or it looks like something it isn't, and gives people more to work with." "People," she said with a particular dryness, "have been working with what they have for 6 months and have not slowed down noticeably. I have stopped managing for their benefit." He sat with this for a moment. "I don't want it to look like you're paying me to stay." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the first real warmth of April was working at the last of the snow, and the sound of melt water ran somewhere beneath the remaining snowpack, a constant low note under everything. Harriet looked at him steadily. You were offered money to leave and refused it without hearing the number, she said. You have slept in a partially constructed cottage through a Colorado winter rather than accept more than you felt you had earned. You have rebuilt a fence, a roof, a floor, a door, a porch, and an entire east wall, and you are about to rebuild the rest of it. She paused. In 3 years, you will have earned every inch of the legal right to this property through work that would have cost me twice what I am paying you at market rate. She held his gaze. I am not paying you to stay. I am recognizing that you are already here. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. All right, she said. The land transfer was filed with the county clerk the following week. Aldous Fenn, who still ran the general store on Main Street and heard about the filing through the network of information that small commercial cities maintain in lieu of a formal news service, reportedly told a customer that he was not surprised, that he had seen something coming from the first moment the Caldwell woman paid that man's tab, that he had always been a good judge of these situations. Everett heard this secondhand from the lumber supplier at Patterson's yard, who told it as a friendly story, without any of the edge that Hollis had put into similar territory 6 months earlier. Everett did not respond to it, but he thought about it on the drive back to the ridge. He thought about Aldous Fenn and the flat outstretched hand, and the sound the dented tin had made on the counter, and the 8 people in that store who had found something else to look at, and the one person who had not. He thought about what it cost to be that person. Not the money, that was the least of it. The cost of being the person who does not look away when looking away is the easier option. The cost Harriet had been paying since December in business relationships and social standing, and the sustained energy of holding her ground against people with more conventional power and longer institutional memories. He had asked her once, sometime in February, whether she regretted it. Not the school, not the lease, the whole thing. The decision made in Fenn's store on a cold October morning that had reorganized both of their lives. She had been quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, I regret that it took something as extreme as watching a man be humiliated over a baby's milk for me to do what I should have been doing for years. He had not known what to say to that then. He still did not exactly, but he thought about it often. The school opened in September. It was not a grand opening. Harriet had been specifically resistant to anything that looked like self-congratulation, a position that the 3 women on the school committee, railroad wives, who had organized the community piece of it with the focused efficiency of people who had been waiting for this opportunity for years, had pushed back on, arguing reasonably that the children's families deserved an occasion. The compromise was a simple gathering, food brought by the families, a brief recognition, and then the actual beginning of the school day, which was the point. 41 children showed up on the first morning. Everett stood at the back of the room and watched a young woman named Opal Finch, who had been teaching in the basement of a church in Durango for 2 years without pay because that was the only option available to her, stand at the front of a proper classroom with proper desks and windows that actually had glass in them, and explain to 41 children between the ages of 6 and 14 how the next 9 months were going to work. Noah, 18 months old and recently and enthusiastically mobile, was on Everett's hip conducting his ongoing census of available interesting things, which currently included a red-haired boy of about 7 in the 3rd row, who was making faces at him with focused creative energy. Harriet was beside Everett. She was watching Opal Finch, and her expression was the most undefended he had ever seen it in a public setting. Not soft exactly, open. All the careful management she normally applied to her public face, simply absent. Not dropped in a moment of carelessness, but set aside deliberately, the way you set aside something you have been carrying a long time when you finally arrive somewhere safe enough to put it down. She reminds you of someone, Everett said quietly. Harriet did not look at him. Yes, she said. He thought about a woman in Ohio 40 years ago, teaching 30 children like their futures were worth investing in. He thought about the specific accumulated weight of good things done by ordinary people, how it moves through time in ways the person who started it never gets to see. How that teacher had almost certainly lived and died without knowing that one of her students had carried the shape of what she did for 4 decades, and eventually built a room for 41 children on a Colorado ridge because of it. He did not say any of this out loud. It was the kind of thought that felt smaller in words than it did in the space it occupied. Opal Finch wrote something on the blackboard. The children in the front row leaned forward simultaneously, as children do when something is about to matter. Noah grabbed the collar of Everett's coat with one fist and said something in his own language that had the cadence of a considered verdict. Yeah, Everett said to him quietly, I know. The Drummond matter surfaced once more in October, almost exactly 1 year after the morning in Fenn's store. A new legal inquiry, this time concerning water rights on the south boundary. Gideon Marsh dispatched it in 3 weeks with a letter that was, by his standards, almost terse. It contained the phrase demonstrably without merit, and the word frivolous, which Harriet read aloud to Everett at the kitchen table with the particular satisfaction of a woman who does not often allow herself that expression. Drummond did not file again. He had found his other property, as Harriet had predicted, a large parcel southeast of Durango whose previous owner, a sheep farmer with fewer resources and less appetite for sustained legal attrition, had found the process exactly as costly as Drummond had calculated. Everett heard about the sheep farmer through the territory's networks. He did not know the man, but he thought about him. He thought about the version of himself that might have heard the number that March morning outside the hardware store on Calvert Street. He could not say with certainty that version did not exist somewhere. He had been very tired in March. His hands had been split at the knuckles since January. His back was a running problem he had stopped pretending otherwise about. Noah was teething again, and the man on the street had said fresh start, as though starting over were a simple thing a man with a toddler and no capital did casually, as though the only thing anchoring Everett to the North Ridge were inconvenience, rather than the specific gravity of a life that had started to mean something. He had not heard the number. He was not going to perform certainty about why. The honest accounting was that by March, the North Ridge was already his in the way that mattered before any legal document caught up with it. Not his by ownership, but his by the knowledge of every fence post and roof beam and floorboard he had put in. By Noah's face in the morning light of that kitchen. By a woman who had stood in the snow holding a rope with both hands and not explaining why, and who had said things at a kitchen table in March that could not be unsaid and had not tried to take them back. The cottage was fully rebuilt by November. The new roof was a single continuous pitch, as Everett had designed it, and it was better than what had been there before, stronger at the joints, properly ventilated, built with the specific knowledge of what the Colorado winter could throw at it because he had watched it throw exactly that. The east wall was sound. The floor was level. The door swung clean in its frame and had done so since January, when he had adjusted the east jamb by a 1/4 inch because it was not quite level and level mattered. He moved back into it in November, which had been the plan, the practical, sensible plan that respected the arrangement and everybody's stated intentions. He lasted 11 days. Not because the cottage was uncomfortable. It was the best it had ever been, warm and solid and genuinely his. But the main house was 200 feet away, and he had been taking his morning coffee there since December of the previous year. And Noah had taken his first real assisted steps in Vera's kitchen, lurching between the table leg and Vera's outstretched hand with the expression of someone who has just discovered that forward motion is available to him and intends to use it extensively. And the path between the cottage and the house was worn into the ground now with the particular intentionality of regular use. And 11 days was long enough to establish that what he had been calling practical was a description that had stopped fitting sometime in the late spring. And he had kept using it because the alternative required going somewhere in person and saying something out loud that he had only said once, at a kitchen table in March, and had not found a second occasion for since. He went up to the main house on an evening in late November and knocked on the front door, which he had not done since October of the previous year, which felt, standing there on the porch in the dark, like a different geography entirely. The same boards, the same iron knocker, but the distance between then and now was not measurable in months. Harriet opened the door. She looked at him with an expression that was not surprise. "I'm not good at being 11 days away from where I actually want to be," he said. "I know." She leaned against the doorframe with the ease of someone who has been waiting for a specific conversation and is relieved it has finally arrived. "I've been watching you be bad at it from the study window. How long were you going to wait?" She considered this with what appeared to be genuine deliberation. "I had estimated another 2 weeks," she said, "but I was prepared to revise." He stood on the porch of the main house. The house that had been built too large for one person, that had held its emptiness like a held breath for 7 years, that had started to feel different around October of the previous year in ways that Harriet had spent several months attributing to practical arrangements and the presence of a useful employee before she stopped being able to attribute it to anything except the truth. The small painted horse on the mantel in the side room, the chair positioned as though someone had only just stood from it. The house had been waiting in its way for the arithmetic to change. "Harriet," he said. "Everett," she said. And something in the way she said it, not the formal address, not Mr. Hart, just his name in the dark of the doorway, made something settle between them that had been looking for a place to land for a long time. "I'm 34 years old," he said. "I have a toddler and a rebuilt cottage I designed myself, and I've been in love with you since February." He paused. "I don't have a speech. I'm not looking for a speech. What are you looking for?" She was quiet for a moment. The November air was very still. Above the ridge, the sky was the particular deep blue of cold, clear nights. The stars doing their usual indifferent and brilliant work, the same stars that had been there every other night of his life, looking no different for everything that had changed beneath them. "Someone who stays," she said. "Someone who shows up when they say they will, and does what they say they'll do." She paused. "And someone who tells me when the door jamb isn't level." Something happened in his chest that was not quite a laugh, shorter than a laugh, more honest. The sound of a man handed the exact right sentence at the exact right moment and not quite knowing how to hold it. "I can do that," he said. She stepped back from the door. He came inside. The winter that followed was the quietest and most ordinary winter of Everett's adult life, which was not to say it was easy. Winters on the North Ridge did not negotiate. There was ice that locked the water pump for 10 days in February and required twice daily thawing. There was a section of fencing on the south pasture that the freeze-thaw cycle had pushed up out of the ground and needed resetting in March. There was the ongoing negotiation with a stove in the main house kitchen that had strong opinions about draw direction and required handling accordingly. But these were the difficulties of a life being lived. Not endured, lived. Noah took his first fully unassisted steps across Vera's kitchen floor on a Wednesday morning in December, lurching from the table leg to the center of the room with the determined expression of someone who has decided that the distance between 2 points is a problem that can be solved through conviction. He made it 4 steps before sitting down with the abruptness of a man who has made his point and is willing to rest on it. Vera said nothing. She simply picked him up, set him back at the table leg, and waited. He made it 6 steps the second time. Everett was on the roof when it happened. Vera came out to the bottom of the ladder and called up to him, and he climbed down faster than was strictly safe and came into the kitchen with sawdust in his hair, and Vera showed him by placing Noah at the table leg again. Noah looked up at his father, registered the audience, and proceeded to cover the full width of the kitchen in what could charitably be called 8 steps, and what was more honestly a controlled fall forward. Everett sat down on the kitchen floor and put his hands on his son's shoulders and looked at him for a long time without saying anything. Noah endured this inspection with the patience of someone who has places to be, but understands the occasion. They were married the following April in the orchard on the North Ridge, with the 3 new trees Everett had planted in the spring beginning to put out their first cautious growth, and the older restored trees rising behind them in early bloom. Noah, 25 months old, walked with the determined lurching efficiency of a toddler who had fully committed to forward motion and was working on the refinements, making his own investigation of the proceedings from Vera's arms, periodically reaching toward Everett with the focused urgency of a child conducting a census of his available people and requiring confirmation that they remain in their correct locations. There was no large ceremony. Harriet had not wanted one. Everett had not wanted one, and the absence of one meant the people who were there were specifically the people they wanted, which was a small number and the right ones. Vera and her husband Thomas, who had returned from town the morning after the February snow to find a rearranged household, and had absorbed this information with the equanimity of a man long accustomed to his wife being ahead of events. Opal Finch because Harriet had wanted her there and could not fully explain why except that it felt right. And explanations that felt right without being fully articulable were, she had come to understand, often the most trustworthy kind. A letter of congratulation from Gideon Marsh had arrived from Denver 3 days late, very formally worded, and was in its way touching. Everett stood in the orchard in his good coat, a new one, the first he had owned in 4 years, still slightly unfamiliar across the shoulders, and looked at Harriet beside him in the April light. He thought about the cost of distance. The years she had spent managing the space between herself and her own life, keeping everything orderly and at arm's length. The small painted horse on the mantel in the side room, the chair that had faced the window for 19 years, waiting for something to come up the drive. He thought about the specific accumulated weight of ordinary decisions made by ordinary people, how it builds in directions you cannot see from inside the building of it. How Harriet Caldwell had stood in the back corner of a general store on a cold October morning and decided not to look away, and how that one decision had moved outward in ways neither of them could have traced from where they stood on the day it was made. The orchard trees moved in the light April wind. Noah made a sound of decisive commentary from Vera's arms. "Yeah," Everett said to him. "I know. The years that followed were not uncomplicated, because no years are. There were difficult winters and a drought that ran 2 summers and cost them 1 full section of the restored orchard before they understood what the water table was doing and adapted. There were disagreements about the school's expansion, about the pace of the land work, about the particular stubbornness that Harriet had correctly identified in Everett and that he had correctly identified in her, and that they had both privately decided was the thing they found most recognizable in each other and therefore most difficult to argue with effectively. But the school grew. Opal Finch hired an assistant by the 2nd year, a young man from the railroad families whose own education had been interrupted, and who turned out to have a gift for arithmetic instruction that the children responded to with something approaching devotion. He worked for half wages the first year and full wages after that, and within 3 years there was a waiting list for the nursery that had to be managed by a committee. The orchard produced its first significant harvest in the autumn of the 2nd full year. The quality of the fruit was specific enough that a supplier in Denver asked about a regular arrangement, which Everett negotiated himself in a letter that Harriet read over his shoulder and corrected once. A small matter of payment timing he had gotten slightly wrong. "You should have let me write it," she said. "I wanted to write it myself." "I know." She handed it back. "That is why I only corrected one thing." Drummond remained in the territory. His operation continued to expand, absorbing properties whose owners lacked the combination of resources and stubbornness that had made the North Ridge unprofitable to pursue. Everett saw him once, at a distance, at a public land assessment meeting in Durango. Drummond looked across the room and found Everett's eyes and held them for a moment, an expression that was neither threat nor concession, but something more like the honest acknowledgement of a man who does not lose often and has filed this particular loss in the appropriate place and moved on. Everett held his gaze and then looked away first because there was nothing he needed to prove to Silus Drummond, and the meeting was starting. The dented tin appeared on a Tuesday in early spring, several years after the morning in Fenn's store. Harriet brought it home from an errand in town without mentioning it until she set it on the kitchen windowsill, and Everett looked up from what he was doing and saw it there. The dent on the left side, the label mostly gone. The small rust circle on the lid from being stored somewhere damp. He knew it immediately, the way you know a thing that made a permanent impression on your body, not just your memory. "I know it's the same one," Harriet said. "The dent is in exactly the right place. I know it's the same one too." They looked at it for a moment. "That was the worst morning of the last 6 years," he said. "I know." She looked at the tin on the sill. "I was there." He picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. He set it back down. "Why did you buy it?" She was quiet for a moment. When she answered, she was not looking at the tin, but at the window, at the orchard beyond it, in its spring version, the new growth just beginning on the branches, the patient evidence of another year of tending. "Because bad mornings are part of the record too," she said, "and I don't want to only keep the good parts." He thought about that for a moment. "Okay," he said. He picked up the tin one more time, turned it in his hands, the familiar weight of it, lighter than memory, heavier than it looked, and set it back in its place on the sill. "Okay," he said again. The tin stayed on the windowsill through the seasons. It was still there the morning Noah, grown and returned from his own years of making his way in the world, brought his own young son into that kitchen and set him on the floor the way he himself had once been set on floors. The boy pulled himself upright against the table leg and conducted his own assessment of the available people, and found them satisfactory in the particular way that children find satisfactory the things that have always simply been there. Noah told his son the story of the tin that day, not in the kitchen, but later, on the street in front of what had once been Fenn's general store, and had since been several other things, and was now something else entirely, its original purpose legible only to people who knew to look. He told it the way his father had told it to him over the years, in layers, the understanding arriving in pieces as the context assembled itself. The boy listened with the focused gravity of a child who understands that a story being told this way, in front of this particular building, means something beyond the words. "She could have just given him money," the boy said. "She could have," Noah said. "Why didn't she?" Noah thought about it. He had thought about it before, had had his own version of this conversation with Everett years ago, standing in this same street, and the answer had not gotten simpler with time. Which was the sign that it was the right question. "Because money fixes the problem," he said. She was interested in the person. The boy considered this with the focused gravity of a child faced with an idea slightly too large and exactly interesting enough to sit with. "Is that harder?" "Yeah," Noah said. "It is. Was it worth it?" Noah looked at the building that had once been Fenn's general store. He thought about the tin on the kitchen windowsill, the orchard in April, the path worn between the cottage and the main house by years of daily use. His father's hands, always slightly scarred at the knuckles from that winter of 1888, when they had split and healed and split again in the cold. His stepmother's voice saying level mattered, with the dry precision of a woman who had decided that some things were worth being exacting about, and had arranged her life accordingly. He thought about the specific accumulated weight of good things done by ordinary people, how it moves through time in ways the person who started it never gets to see, spreading outward from a single moment in a general store on a cold October morning when one person decided not to look away. "Yeah," he said. "It was worth it." He put his hand on his son's head, the same gesture, though he did not know it consciously, that his father had used on him on 100 ordinary mornings, the particular weight of a parent's hand that says everything it needs to say without saying any of it. They walked back through Durango in the afternoon light, the boy asking questions that Noah answered as honestly as he could, and sometimes more honestly than was strictly comfortable, which was the right way to answer a child's questions when the child is paying attention. And behind them, on the North Ridge, the orchard was doing what it did every year, reliably and without drama. The trees bearing what they bore, the land holding what it held. The path between the cottage and the main house worn into the ground by years of daily use, walked every morning by people who had stopped noticing they were walking it, which was how you knew it had become what it was always meant to be. Not a path between two structures, a path between two people who had decided, in their different ways and at their different speeds, that showing up was the whole of it. That the fence post driven a foot deeper than necessary and the door jamb adjusted a quarter inch and the morning coffee made for 3 instead of 2 were not small things at all, but the actual substance of a life, the daily unremarkable accumulation of someone who stays. The orchard bloomed every April, the tin sat on the windowsill, the path was walked every morning. And the stars above the North Ridge went on doing what they always did, indifferent and brilliant and entirely unchanged, looking down on the particular difficulties and the particular graces of human beings, trying to figure out what they owe each other, and what they are allowed to want, and whether those two things are as different as they first appeared.